The sound came up out of the ground a little after 5 in the morning, before there was light enough to name the color of anything. A low, steady rushing of cold water over stone that had no business running in that country in that year, and it moved out across the dust and the burned corn and the dead pasture the way a bell moves across still water, and the people who heard it had already been standing at her gate for the better part of an hour, some of them with buckets and milk cans and wash tubs and whole barrels lashed down into the beds of wagons that had nothing else to haul, waiting. They held their hats in their hands. That was the thing a stranger would have marked first, if any stranger had been fool enough to be in that county in the 4th summer, the 2nd of the drought. Grown men standing in a woman's dooryard at first light with their hats pressed flat against their chests, the way a man holds his hat in a church, or over a grave, and not the way a man holds it when he has come to buy water by the bucket from a widow the whole town had laughed at on the courthouse steps 4 years before. There was Harldeed near the front, who had set the price of her ground at nothing with his own mouth, and behind him the storekeeper she still owed $1 to, and behind him half the good families of the upland, and none of them was talking, for there was nothing left in any of them to say that the water was not already saying plainer, and they shifted their weight, and quieted their teams, and turned their hats slow in their hands, and waited on a widow to open her door, and the only voices in the whole gray yard were the ducks stirring on the water, and the water itself. She was inside, and she was counting. She had a way of counting under her breath that her lips barely moved for, a habit older than her trouble, and she went down the line of receipts she kept in a cigar box on the shelf over the stove, folding each one once along a crease already worn soft, the way a person folds a thing they mean to keep, and she counted the money she had taken in the day before, and the money still owed to her, and the birds she had put out on the water the evening past, and only when she had the whole of it settled and square in her head did she reach for the door. She had bought the 100 acres for 40 cents an acre, $40 in front of the whole town, for 100 acres of ground that every man now standing in her yard had sworn on his own name would never again grow a thing worth the hauling to market. Remember that. $40 and $11.40 she had counted out in coin on top of it to clear the back taxes, and a flock of 9 ducks and a drake she had bought with very nearly the last money she owned in the world. And now the same men who had set the worth of that ground at nothing were standing in her dooryard with their hats in their hands because she had the only living water for 11 miles in any direction, running cold and clean and steady out of a thing that not one of them had ever known was there. What none of them understood, not yet, standing in the gray light with their empty barrels and their hats against their chests, was that the sound was not new. It was older than the town that had laughed at her. It had been running the whole time, down under 4 feet of river silt and 100 acres of weed, patient and covered and waiting, through every dry year and every wet one, through the fever that took her husband and the laughing that took her name, and the long, slow seasons after. And it had only ever been waiting for something, with enough patience of its own, to come and lift the weight of the world off the top of it. She opened the door, and the low sun came up behind the men, and turned the risen dust to gold in the air over their heads, and she looked out at them, and she did not smile, and she did not gloat, and she did not say a single word about the 4 years, because there was nothing left in her that needed to. There was only the water, going on and on under everything, and the count settled in her head, and the receipts folded soft in the box. She had learned a long while before, in a hard school and alone, that the surest things in this world make no argument at all. They only keep on. Down under the west rise of that ground, where the land dipped toward the old river channel, and the willows had gone to gray bone in the drought, there stood a room of cut stone the size of a corn crib, and no one living had ever laid eyes on it. It had been built by the first families that ever broke ground in that bottom, the ones the town of Collie itself was named for, men and women who came into that country with nothing but their hands and one piece of knowledge worth more than money, which was that where cold water rises clean out of the foot of a hill, a body builds over it in stone, and keeps it clean, and never, as long as the family name holds the land, lets it be lost or lets it be forgotten. They had quarried the stone by hand and squared it and dressed it and set it dry, without a spoonful of mortar, fitted so close a knife blade would not pass the joints, over the mouth of a spring that came up cold out of the base of the rise at 40 gallons a minute, cold in the worst August heat, and never once locked with ice in the worst of the winter. They had capped it and roofed it low and cut a straight stone channel to carry the overflow away toward the river, and for 2 full generations that little stone house was the whole reason anything green ever lived down in that bottom at all. Then the families died out, or married away, or went west chasing something, the way families do, and the knowing of the thing went out of the world with the last of them, and the final old man who could have walked to it in the dark and laid his hand on the capstone was himself laid in the churchyard, and after that the pump house belonged to nobody but the ground. And then the river took it. Not all at once, for a river does nothing all at once. It took it over a bad spring and then a worse one, backing its brown flood up over the low ground and dropping its load of silt an inch and then a hand's width and then a foot and then more than a man is tall, until the straight stone channel choked and drowned, and the overflow spread and soured the low corner, and the roof of the little house went under the mud, and the willows seeded in green over the top of it, and then the weed came in behind the willows, and after that there was not a man alive in the county with any reason on earth to believe there was a single squared stone anywhere in the whole 100 ruined acres. But the spring did not stop. That is the part that carried the whole of the rest, though it would be years before it meant anything to anyone. Water that has been rising up out of the dark for 1,000 years does not care that a river has laid 4 feet of mud across its roof. It went on rising, and it seeped up sideways through the silt where the weight was least, and it kept the one lowest corner of that field wet and black and useless looking, in a way that every plowman who ever cursed the ground read as rot and ruin, and it waited, having all the time there ever was, being the one thing on that whole poisoned 100 acres that had never once in its life been told how to quit. That black wet corner was the whole spine of the thing, though no man would have believed such a claim made of a wet corner, and it kept its own slow calendar down there under the mud, through every year that the field stood cursed and idle. In the spring it weeped up cold, and stood in a bright sheet across the low ground, and drew the killdeer and the snipe down to it out of a gray sky. In the deep of summer, when the whole rest of the bottom cracked open and blew away in a bitter dust, it alone stayed dark and soft and green, and it drew for that the curse of every farmer who read the green of it as rot, and the softness of it as a kind of ruin that could spread. In the fall, the willows over it went to yellow and then to bone, and the dead weed leaned and rattled all around it in the wind, and still the cold came up out of it. It swallowed, it kept. It waited, the way the rest of the 100 acres never could, being ground that men had broken and left, and it held down inside itself under 4 feet of river silt, a room of squared stone, and a mouth of running water, and 40 gallons a minute of the one answer that no plow in that country had ever once thought to ask the ground for, and it did not tell a living soul, and it was in no hurry at all about any of it, having already outweighted the families that cut the stone and the river that drowned it, and meaning, as plainly as a thing without a voice can mean anything, to outweight the town as well. Go back then, to before any of it, to the hard winter she was left alone in the world. She had come into that county a bride not 2 years married, and been made a widow inside of it, for the fever that took her husband took him the quick way that it took men in the bottoms, 3 days from the first shaking chill to the last breath drawn, and it left her with the things a young woman is left with in a place where she has no people of her own to close ranks around her. She owned exactly 1 milk cow, and that gone dry, which she led to the sale barn on a rope by her own hand and sold for 1/3 under its worth, because every man at the barn could see plain that she had to sell it that day and not the next. She owned a wedding quilt her mother had pieced, and a good wool winter coat, and a mended pair of her husband's boots she could not make herself sell for any price. She held the lease on a 2-room house at the ragged edge of town that ran out at the end of the coming autumn, and against that lease she was 4 months behind on the rent, and at the general store she carried a bill of $6 and some odd cents that she paid down $1 at a time, on the 10th day of every month without fail. In coin she counted over twice on the counter before she would let it go from her fingers. Her name was Della Voss, and she was 22 years old, and she had a plain, steady voice that she had not been born with, that she had cut and built for herself over that first killing winter, the way a person builds anything they mean to lean their whole weight on for the rest of their days. That voice was the one thing she made that year that no man could take back off of her. She had no horse and no wagon and no near kin and no standing and no name that carried the smallest weight with anybody in that town, and so she walked wherever she went, in every weather, and she watched every single thing that she passed. That was the true beginning of the whole of it, though not one soul who saw her out on the road would have called it anything but a poor young widow taking the long way round because she had no other way to travel. She walked the river road and she watched the water, where it stood and where it moved and where it soaked away. She walked past the good farms and the failing ones alike, and she marked which fields greened first when the frost broke, and which of them held their moisture on into the dry heart of July, and which cracked open gray by the middle of June. And she did not rightly know why she was keeping so careful a ledger of it in her head, only that she had kept one, of everything, for as long as she could remember, since she was a girl small enough to fold herself under the kitchen table and count the boots that went by. She counted the way that other people breathe, without deciding to. She had counted the days of her husband's dying, and she had counted the coin on the store counter twice over, and she counted, without ever meaning to, the ducks that an old Frisian named Vink kept on the drowned quarter-acre behind his shack at the edge of town. And the count came out at 19, and she held it, and she did not yet have the least idea that the whole shape of the rest of her life lay hidden and folded inside that one useless, unasked-for number. She kept a strict house on almost nothing at all, which is a labor that the well-fed never see and never once think to count. She paid the rent down when she was able, and she carried it forward when she was not, and she knew to the day exactly how far behind she stood. 4 months, and then 3, and then 4 again, as the seasons turned against her. She sold the dry cow, and then in the end she sold the good wool coat too, when it came down to the coat or the rent, and she kept only the wedding quilt her mother had pieced, and the mended boots that no man would have handed her a coin for anyway. She ate what she could raise in a spade-turned patch behind the 2 rooms and what a few eggs would trade for at the store, and she walked into town on the 10th of every month with her $1 counted and folded soft, and she walked home again the long way by the river, and she was, by every measure that the town of Collie knew how to take of a person, a woman with nothing and going nowhere, and that measure was exactly and only as deep as the eye that troubled itself to take it. The town had made up its mind about her, and it had made it up the worst way there is, which is not with scorn, but with pity. Scorn a person can set their back against. Scorn hands a person a wall to push on, and the pushing keeps the blood moving, and keeps a body warm through a cold season. But the town of Collie did not scorn Della Voss. It pitied her, and it pitied her out loud and to her face and behind her back in the very same soft breath. The kindest of the women shaking their heads over her, across the store counter, and saying it was a shame. A young thing like that, no people, no man, no prospects at all, and the harder ones saying low that she ought to go back to wherever it was she had come from, and do it before the winter finished the work the fever had started. They pitied the way she paid her bill $1 at a time. They pitied the mended boots and the coat gone thin at the elbow and the plain gray dresses and the long walk home in the dusk. And a man who owned 300 acres of good upland told his wife across the supper table that somebody in this town really ought to do something for the poor Voss widow, and then he did not, and neither did she, because pity is a feeling that does the whole of its work inside the one who is feeling it and asks nothing further of them, and that is the exact reason it is a far heavier thing to carry than to be hated. Della Voss carried it the way she carried all of it, without one word, and she let them believe it was slowly crushing her, because it cost her not one thing to let them believe it, and because a woman who is being pitied is a woman who is not for one moment being watched, and she was watching. That was the thing that not a one of them could see, and not a one of them ever once thought to set a price on. Behind the plain, steady voice, and the folded receipts, and the long walks home in the dark, there was a mind that took a full accounting of everything it passed and let go of none of it, that knew to the coin what she was owed and knew to the day when a debt fell due, that had counted the 19 ducks and marked which low fields held their water into August and which burned out by June, and exactly where in the whole wide bottom the ground stayed black and wet and green, when everything around it had gone to gray dust and blowing dirt. She watched the way a man watches weather that is making up its mind whether to turn bad on him, steady and close and without any show of it whatsoever, and she remembered clean what she watched, and she kept it, and none of it looked like anything at all. That is the trouble with the only kind of wealth that a poor young widow is ever allowed to lay by. It does not shine. It does not clink in a jar where a body can hear it. It cannot be carried in to a banker or shown across a fence to a suitor, or laid before a mother-in-law as proof that a life is being properly got on with. It is only a habit of the eye and a stubbornness of the memory, watching and counting and holding and letting nothing go, and the whole of Collie looked clean through it every day of that first long year, and saw a woman to be felt sorry for, and it was the single most valuable thing standing anywhere within 100 miles of that town, and it was hers, and it was already quietly at its work. It showed itself only in small ways that nobody around her thought worth the marking. She could have named it all off, had anyone ever once thought to ask her, which merchant shorted his measure at the scale, and which gave honest weight, and which shallow well in town went brackish first in a dry spell, and which one held sweet the longest into a drought, and how many good rains the bottom had taken in a season, and how many days it had gone dry between them, and she carried the whole of it, not written on any paper at all, but held clean and ordered in her head, where no fire and no creditor and no smooth-talking man could ever reach it. She had noticed the black wet corner the first autumn she ever walked that road, and she had noticed that it stayed green straight through the July that burned everything else in the bottom to gray straw, and she said not one word about it to a living soul, and she did not let it go, and she turned it over in her mind through the whole of that first hard winter alone, the way a person turns a smooth stone over and over in a coat pocket, and by the time the county at last put the old Vane place up for its back taxes she already knew, without ever once being able to say plainly how it was she knew, that the ground was nowhere near so dead as the men who had set the price of it. The ground itself, the 100 acres in the Seth Bottoms, had a history of its own, and it was a history of men and of their certainty, which is the only kind of history that ever truly ruins good ground. In the beginning of it, that field was the best land in the whole bottom, spring-fed and black and deep, and the first families worked it small and worked it patient and let the cold water do the half of the labor for them, and then they were gone off the earth, and after a long spell of nobody, a man named Emmett Vane bought the whole bottom at once, on a loan borrowed against a rising market, and set himself to make it pay the way the market and the almanac and his own pride all told him that ground was bound to pay. He tore out the old cross fences that the first families had strung, the ones that had let the low, wet corner lie easy under grass. He broke the sod clean across every acre of it, and put the whole 100 to one single crop, wheat the first year and corn the year after, chasing the high price, and he laughed at the old notion of leaving any part of it back in grass to rest, and he drove his plow straight through the black wet corner, and cursed it for miring his team to the hocks, and swore aloud that he would drain that corner, or break it in the trying. He broke it. He broke the whole 100 acres the way a man breaks a thing he was dead certain he understood the whole of. And then the big water came the very spring, the high price finally broke and fell, and the river laid its silt across the low third of the field, and Emmett Vane walked away from his loan, and out of the county and off the ground for good, and what rose up out of that broken and silted and disturbed dirt the following summer, thick as an animal's winter coat and higher than a tall man's head by August, was ragweed. It took the field the way ragweed takes any ground that has been broken and used hard and then abandoned, which is the one thing in all of creation that the plant was ever made to do. It came up first along the plow scars and the silt line, and it seeded itself by the 1,000 and then the 10,000, every single plant throwing seed enough to choke an acre by itself, and that seed lay down in the dirt and kept its own kind of patient waiting, years of it, so that every time a hopeful man disturbed the ground again, a fresh green crop of it rose up thicker and meaner than the last. Cattle would not touch it. A man ran a dozen steers on it one summer, and they ate all around it and starved down to their ribs on the good grass it had crowded out and killed, and the little hay that could be cut off the clean edges of the field carried the bitter dust of it into the barn and set every animal in the stalls and half the men in the loft to wheezing and streaming at the eyes through the whole of August, so that the ground earned a name for sickness laid right on top of its name for ruin. They burned it off in the fall, and it came back the next spring thicker than before, for fire on that ground did nothing but clear a warm black seedbed for the waiting seed. They plowed it under in a rage, and to plow under a standing field of ragweed is nothing on this earth but to plant it deeper and wider, and it rose up green behind the moldboard as if it were laughing at the man who held the handles. They gave up and let it lie, and lying still it walked, a foot and then a yard at a time, right through the wire and into the fences of every neighbor whose land it touched, until the whole bottom cursed the old Vane place with one voice, and the county took it at last for the unpaid taxes, and then could not give it away. And it sat there on the county books, 3 years running, with no bidder and no earthly hope of one. 100 acres of poisoned, weed-choked, fever-dusted ground, that every reasonable man in that country agreed among themselves was as good as dead, and that all of them together had long since stopped so much as turning their heads to look at. All of them but the one poor widow who took the long way home along the river road and marked the single black wet corner that stayed green when all the rest of the world burned, and counted, and said not one word, and remembered. The county sold it off on the courthouse steps on a bright and bitter cold morning in the third week of that same autumn, the very autumn her lease was set to run out from under her. And a tax sale of that kind is a thing men come out for the show, of far more than the buying, and there was a fair crowd of them gathered on the stone steps, blowing into their cupped hands, and joking back and forth over who in the county would turn out fool enough to lay down a bid on the old vain weed patch. The clerk read the parcel out in the same flat voice he read out everything, 100 acres more or less lying in the Sethi bottoms, and he read the terms of the sale, and then he read the old language straight off the original land patent the way the law bound him to read it, that the said ground was conveyed together with all its waters and improvements thereon, both known and unknown, and the whole crowd on the steps laughed out loud at that, laughed at the bare notion that there was a single improvement, or one usable drop of water anywhere in all that ruined hundred, and the clerk stood and waited for the laughing to run itself down, and then he called for a bid. Nobody spoke. And then a young widow in a mended coat, who had walked to the courthouse that morning because she had no other way in the world to come, said 40 cents an acre in a plain and steady voice, and the whole crowd turned as one man to look at her, and the laughing broke out again, louder this time and uglier, because now it had a place to go and a face to land on. $40 for the weed patch. She did not laugh along with them, and she did not color at the neck, and she did not drop her eyes to the stone. She stood and waited for the clerk to call twice more for any bid above her own, and no bid came, for a man will not bid against a joke he is enjoying, and the ground was struck down to her, and she counted out her $40 and her $11.40 of back taxes in careful coin into the clerk's hand, and she folded her receipt once along the crease and put it away inside her coat, and she walked back down the courthouse steps, through the very middle of their laughing, with her chin held level, not lifted and not dropped, only held dead level, and she went home. It was the old Frisian Vink who came up her path that same evening, for Vink was the one man in all that county who had never once in his life been granted the standing to laugh at anybody. He was old and he was poor, and he was foreign in a way that the town would never let him set down and forget, and he had come out of a low country on the far side of the water, that was itself mostly water, held back from the sea only by the patience of people who had learned across 1,000 years to work with drowned ground instead of forever against it, and he had kept ducks his whole life long, on the worst quarter acre in 3 counties, and been thought a harmless old fool for it every day. He came up her path in the dusk with something cupped careful in both his old hands, and he did not tell her he was sorry for her trouble, and he did not tell her she had been brave, and he did not tell her she had been a fool. He said none of the things that the town said. He told her instead that ground like hers, broken ground, silted ground, weed-choked ground, that every clean-handed man in the county had given up on and turned his back to, was not dead ground, whatever they called it. He said that men look on a field that will not answer to the plow, and they name it ruined, and they are wrong every time, because the plow is only the one question, and the ground, he said, has more than the one answer folded up inside it. Then he took her hand and turned it over palm up and pressed down into it a duck egg, still warm from under the bird, and he closed her cold fingers over the top of it one at a time, and he told her the thing that she would carry with her the whole rest of her life, and hand on again at the very end of it. No ground is so poor it has nothing left to give, he said. It only waits on the one patient enough to take it slow. The method was ducks, and the method was a simple thing to say and a long thing to do, which is the truest and the only lasting kind of method there is. A duck will eat ragweed. It will eat the tender young shoots of it in the spring before the plant hardens off, and it will eat the ripe seed of it off the bare ground all through the fall and the winter after, and it will do the both of those things season upon season, without ever once tiring of the labor, and without ever needing to be told a word about it. And if a body puts enough ducks onto a field of ragweed, and moves them across the ground the right way at the right turn of the year, they will eat the young plants down to the dirt before ever a one of them can throw its seed, and they will eat the fallen seed of the old plants before ever a one of it can sprout, and the great buried bank of seed lying down in that dirt, the years and the years of it that Emmett Vane's plow had planted, will begin, one slow season at a time, to fall. Vink gave her the drake, the best-blooded breeder he owned in the world, and she bought 9 ducks with very nearly her last coin, 10 birds all told, and she carried them out to the ruined ground in a slatted crate lashed onto a handcart she had borrowed for the day, and she loosed them on the one black wet corner that stayed green, because Vink had told her that a duck wants water above every other thing on earth and will work hardest and stay closest wherever the ground lies wettest, and she did not yet have the first notion of why that one corner lay so wet. She herded them. That was the labor of the thing, and it was the labor of years and not of days. She could not simply turn 10 ducks loose across 100 acres and stand back and wait for the weed to fall. She had to keep them working the ground in narrow sections, one strip of it at a time, holding them tight on the young growth in the spring, until they had grazed it clean down to the black dirt, and then moving them on to the next, and then driving them back over the seeded strips again in the fall to glean up every seed that had dropped, walking behind the whole flock with a long willow switch morning and evening, in the wet and the cold and the choking August dust that set her wheezing worse than any of the birds, counting them onto the water at first light and counting them off it again at full dark, and never one time in all those years losing the count. The first summer looked to the world like nothing at all. A stranger on the river road would have seen only a poor widow driving a little handful of ducks through a weed patch bigger than the whole town, and shaken his head at the pity of it, and the town did see exactly that, and said exactly that across the store counter, and she let them say it. But she was watching the seed heads. And by the second autumn there were fewer of them standing along the strips she had worked first, fewer plants and shorter ones, and thinner stands where the year before there had been a wall of it over her head, and the flock that had gone out 10 birds in the spring was better than 80 strong by the fall, for ducks worked and fed and kept safe on good clean water, do the one other thing on earth that ducks were put here to do, which is to make more ducks. She measured the passing years in the falling of the weed and not in anything else. By the second autumn, the first strips had gone thin. By the third dry spring, there was grass, true green grass, coming up in the low corner where nothing but ragweed had stood for a full 10 years, and the flock was past 300 head, and she was carrying eggs and dressed birds into town to sell now, a few at a market day, and paying down every debt she owed a coin at a time, and still not a living soul in all of Collie understood that anything whatsoever was happening out in the Setha bottoms, because what was happening was slow, and slow is the one speed that the human eye was made worse to see. There were small failures all the way through it, and she counted those the very same as she counted the rest. A hard, late cold snap in the second spring took a whole clutch of ducklings off the water, and she carried the loss in her head and made it good again by the fall. A fox worked the water's edge one whole autumn and thinned the flock by night, and she sat out 3 cold nights on the rise to learn his hour, and then she stopped him for good, and she did not lose the count. A wet year set the ragweed back up thicker along the high strips, and cost her a full extra season of driving the flock over ground she had already thought clean, and she did not curse it and she did not quit it. She only moved the birds and held her patience, and let the slow blind arithmetic of the seed bank go on falling under them. 1 head of seed, and then 1,000 heads of it, one season laid down patient upon the last. The first thing that could not be argued with came up out of the ground in the 4th spring, and it came up on account of the ducks. They had worked that black wet corner harder than any other ground on the whole place, year over year over year, because it was the wettest of all of it and they loved it the best, paddling and grubbing and puddling the soft mud of it hour upon hour. And where 100 and more ducks work a wet corner season after season, the mud does not stay lying where it was. It gives, and it slumps, and it moves. And one gray morning she was counting the flock out onto the water at first light when she saw that a knot of them had gathered along the one edge of the seep and were working hard at something down in the mud, and she walked over to see. There was a stone. It was a squared stone, cut and dressed clean by a human hand, and it belonged to no river that ever ran, and she went down on her knees in the cold mud and laid her bare fingers along the edge of it and felt the true straight line of it that no flood on earth ever made, and she began, that day and every day that came after it, with her own 2 hands, and the boys beside them, to take the silt off the top of that stone. Under the first stone there was a second. Under the willows and the years of mud, in the shape the ducks themselves had opened up, there was a wall, and then there was a squared corner, and then there was the low stone roof of a little house, and inside of it, when she had cleared the choked stone channel out with a spade, The cold water came welling up out of the dark at the rate it had always come, 40 gallons every minute, and ran out clean over the worn lip of the stone, and away down the old cut channel toward the river, running in the open light of day for the first time in longer than any man then breathing in that county had been alive. She told no one. She cleared the channel, and she set the capstone true, and then she walked the long road to the county seat, and she read the whole recorded history of that ground, every line of it, back to the first patent, and she wrote out in her own careful hand the things she found written there, and she folded that paper once along the crease and laid it in the cigar box with the receipts. And she said nothing. It was the water that fetched the smooth man out, and it was the water alone that he had come for, though he was a far too polished a man ever to say so at a widow's door. He came in a good black coat in a hired buggy on a fair afternoon in the 5th year. A Mr. Sowell, an agent, he named himself, for a milling and land company out of the city, and he was all soft kindness and slow warmth and gentle regret from the very first word out of him, and he sat himself down in her 2 plain rooms and turned his good hat slowly in his hands and told her at some length what a hard thing it was, what a terribly hard thing it must surely have been, for a lone woman to have taken on such a piece of ruined ground with no help and no man, and how his company held a long and settled and proper interest in the waters of that whole bottom, an old claim, he said, surveyed and filed and paper perfect, reaching back to well before her own time on the land, and how it grieved him more than he could rightly say to have to bring fresh trouble to her door, on top of all the trouble she had already borne. But the water was spoken for. It had been spoken for by his company since before ever she was born into this world. And the kindest thing, the decent and the Christian thing, the only sensible thing for a woman in her hard position to do, would be to take a fair cash price for the whole 100 acres now, that very day, from his own hand, and be spared the sure ruin of a long fight over paper that she could not hope to read. He talked a long while. He was a man who believed, the settled way that his kind of man believes it down to the bone, that the one who talks the longest and the softest and the most regretful of all is the one who drives home at evening with the deed folded in his coat. He talked himself clean past his own edge, the way that kind of man always in the end will do. Somewhere in the long, warm, easy middle of all of it, guiding her gentle toward the sail, meaning only to show her just how thoroughly and how completely his company already knew the true worth of the thing they meant to buy off her for a song. He named it. He spoke of the old Collie pump house, of the capped spring lying under the west rise, of the dry-laid stoneworks, and the cold 40-gallon flow of it, spoke of the whole of it by its name and by its exact number, as of a thing his company had always and forever known, was down there waiting under the weed and the silt, a thing worth more by itself than the whole 100 acres of ground laid over the top of it. And he did not so much as slow the roll of his own voice, for he did not hear the thing that he had let fall. She heard it. She had cleared that stone out of the mud with her own bare hands not 3 months gone, and had breathed a word of it to no living soul on the earth, and there was no line drawn in any survey that a stranger could carry into her house that would tell him the running flow of a spring buried 4 feet down under the river mud. And in the whole space of that one soft, careless sentence, she understood the entire shape of it at last, understood that his company had known the water was down there the whole long while, had known it and abandoned it, and let it lie buried, and let the ground above it be sold off for taxes as worthless. Because worthless ground is a cheap thing to walk away from, and a cheaper thing yet to come back and buy up later for nothing, and that the thing had never once, not for a single day, been truly worth nothing at all, and that they had stood back and let a whole town laugh a poor widow up the courthouse steps over ground that they themselves knew held a spring worth a small fortune. She counted, once, under her breath, the way that she always did. Then she said only that she would want to see his paper. That was the whole of what she said, and it was an answer, and the smooth man never felt the floor go out from beneath his boots. Because she had already read the record, the whole of it, in her own hand in the cigar box on the shelf, and she knew exactly what his paper was, and exactly what it was worth. His company's claim to that water was a claim of the old kind, the kind that the law of that country keeps alive only just so long as the water is truly used and the works are truly kept. And his company had abandoned those works the very spring of the big flood and never after laid a hand to them again, had stopped paying the small yearly assessment on the right in the same year the river drowned the stone, and the county courthouse held the plain record of the last year they had paid it, a date, filed and public and there for anyone patient enough to go and read. and past a set term of years a water right that is left unused and unkept is forfeit under the law, gone, dead as the ground that everyone had sworn was dead, and it had stood forfeit for longer than the well-dressed man sitting in her front room had been drawing breath. And her own deed, struck down to her on the courthouse steps for $40 while the whole crowd laughed on the cold stone, conveyed that ground to her, together with all its waters and improvements thereon, both known and unknown, the very words the clerk had read out that morning into the laughter of the crowd, the very words that had been the whole joke of the day, because every man there knew for a certainty that there was nothing under that field but weed. She brought out the folded deed, and she brought out the record of the forfeiture, with the last date his company had paid set down plain upon it, and she laid the two papers side by side on the table between them, and she did not raise her voice by so much as a half a note, because the plain steady voice she had built for herself over that first hard winter carried further laid flat than any other soul's shouting. She had watched, she had counted, she had walked to the county seat and read down every line of it and kept every last date. Mr. Sowell gathered his good black coat in around him, and gathered up his dead paper off the table, and told her stiffly that she was making a grave mistake, and she said nothing back to him at all, and that was an answer too, and he drove his hired buggy out of that county the same afternoon, and was never once seen within the bounds of it again. Then came the second summer with no rain, and after it the third season that would not break, and the drought that turned the whole town clean around was fully upon them, and it ruined every last man who had done the sensible and the settled thing. The uplands burned off first, the good 300-acre farms that had pitied her across their supper tables, their corn curling and firing standing in the row, their deep wells dropping and then dropping again, and then sucking dry at the bottom, their cattle sold off in a rush at a hard loss, because there was no water left to hold them, and no grass grown up to carry them, and the creeks ran down to cracked gray mud, and the shallow town wells gave up a single bucket of warm rust in the early morning, and then nothing at all by noon, and one wagon at a time, the very same men who had set the worth of her ground at nothing, came down the river road, through their own blowing dust, to the one single place in 11 miles where cold water still ran in the open air, 40 gallons of it every minute of the day and the night, welling up cold out of a stone house that a flock of ducks had dug up out of a ruined field. She did not turn a single soul away from her gate, and she did not gouge a single soul either, and she was no kind of a fool about any of it, which the town came to understand far better and far quicker than they would ever have understood a saint. She set the water at a fair price, and not at a low one, a fair price being the only honest kind there is. And she took the good coin of those who had coin to give, and for the families who had none, she wrote not one figure down in any book, but asked instead only for a handshake and a season's grace to pay. And she let them fill their barrels to the brim on nothing but their given word. Whole households that had pitied her 4 years gone by now taking their living water down out of her own hand on nothing but their promise, and not a one of them ever found the words to thank her the way that they wanted to. Because there are no thanks made big enough for that, and every soul standing in that yard knew it, and so they took their hats off of their heads instead, and stood bareheaded in her dooryard at first light, with their hats held flat against their chests, and that was the whole of the thanks they had in them, and it was enough, and it is where all of this began. And she stood in her doorway in the gold-rising dust of that fourth summer, and looked out at the length of them, and every last withheld thing came round the long way and landed. $40 for 100 acres, 40 cents to the acre, $11.40 counted out in back taxes on the courthouse steps, 9 ducks and a drake that were a flock past 1,000 head now, and spread out white as a field of snow, across water that had not failed and would not fail, and 4 years to the season since the laughing on the cold stone steps, and a stone house under the west rise that the whole town had sold to her as nothing at all, running its 40 gallons a minute out into the driest year that any man then living could call to mind, filling up the barrels of the very men who had priced it at nothing, on and on through the drought that had broken every soul who had trusted the plow over the long patience of water. The joke had gone all the way around. It had set out from the courthouse steps 4 years before as their joke, made about her, told at her expense to her face, and it had traveled the long, slow, patient way that such things travel in this world, season laid upon season, and it had come home at the last as her clean water standing in their barrels, and no man laughed now, and she did not laugh either, standing in her door, because she had never one single time in all of it needed to. And Vink lived to see the whole of it, the old Frisian who had put the warm egg down into her hand in the dusk and told her the ground was only waiting, and she saw to it that he was rewarded far past any counting she could do, gave him a good tight house up on the high dry edge of her ground, and a full share of the flock, and every plain comfort that his long and hard and laughed at life had never one time shown him. And he grew very old there in peace, and sat in the sun by the running water in the last of his years, and watched the ducks that were the great-grandchildren of his own birds work the green ground, and he died content in his bed, having been proved right in the end, about the one thing that the world had ever let him be right about, which is a good deal more than most men are given. And the boy grew up, the tall boy, Rennie, that the drought had made an orphan of, and that she had taken in off the road, and set to the keeping of the tally, a boy gone grave beyond his few years, who counted the flock out onto the water at dawn, and off it again at dark, exactly the way that she had taught him, and never one time lost the count. And he grew into a steady man who ran the whole 100 acres and knew the working of the spring and the moving of the flock better than any other man then alive, holding the whole method safe in his own 2 hands, so that the knowing of it would outlast her the same as it had outlasted the first families who cut and set the stone. And the smooth man was gone, and he stayed gone. And she herself grew old on that ground, Della Voss, and she grew old content upon it. And the cold water ran the whole while under everything that she did, steady and clean and sure. She was an old woman the day the young one came to her, a stranger, a girl left all alone in the world the way that she herself had once been left all alone, come walking down the river road on her own 2 feet, because she had no other way in the world to come, sent along to the ground that the whole county now spoke of the way people speak of a thing that against all the odds turned out to be true. And the old woman took the girl out to the little stone house under the west rise and let her stand and hear the water come welling up cold out of the dark. And then she reached her hand down into the nest and brought up an egg still warm from under the bird, and she turned the girl's cold hand over palm up and pressed the warm egg down into it and closed the young fingers over the top of it one at a time, the very same way that it had once in the dusk been done for her, and she told her the thing. "No ground is so poor it has nothing left to give," she said. "It only waits on the one patient enough to take it slow." And the girl stood and held the warm egg and did not yet understand it, the way that not one of them ever understands it at the first telling, and the 2 of them stood there together in the low stone house in the cool of it. And under both their feet and under the whole of the ruined and the saved 100 acres, the cold water that had never one time in 1,000 years been told how to stop, went on rising up out of the dark and running out clean over the worn stone and away toward the river, steady and clean and sure, 40 gallons every minute, on and on past the last word that either one of them had spoken, and it is running there yet.